Your attitude about this is very sociopathic. You saw something horrible and you don't care about it. Sociopathic? I don't know. You guys are detectives, aren't you supposed to figure this out? You're putting on a pretty good show. A show? Yeah? Sitting across from homicide investigators inside a windowless interrogation room is 17-year-old Carlos Hollowell. His physical posture remains completely relaxed. His voice remains flat, almost bored. On the surface, this clean-cut, intelligent teenager was living a highly successful life in a quiet, lakeside neighborhood in Citrus County, Florida. But behind this carefully constructed facade was a calculated predator who had just executed his own adoptive mother, Denise, inside her bedroom. When backed into a corner by investigators, his defense was simple. He couldn't have done it because he was busy eating pie and taking a napping. But as investigators looked into this claim, they discovered a terrifying reality. What happened next changed the entire case. To understand how a family sanctuary turns into a staged horror movie, we have to look closer at the world Carlos was about to destroy. Denise Hollowell was a deeply empathetic woman, known throughout her community as a dedicated, forever mom who had opened her heart and her home to rescue children who needed a second chance at life. Her home was supposed to be a safe haven, tucked away near the water, surrounded by trees, protected by multiple aggressive family dogs. It was a place where danger could never breach the perimeter. Then the first anomaly surfaced. It is 6:15 p.m. on July 19, 2019. The sun is beginning to set over the lake when emergency dispatchers receive a frantic, high-panic 911 call from inside the property. It is the 17-year-old boy sitting in that room, Carlos Hollowell. His voice is trembling, breathless, screaming for emergency units to rush to the scene. He tells the dispatcher he has just walked into his mother's room and found her covered in blood. He sounds like a terrified, grieving child facing an unthinkable nightmare. But as the first deputies arrive on scene and cross the threshold, the atmosphere shifts instantly. The house is completely quiet. The aggressive family dogs are not barking. In fact, they are perfectly calm. But investigators would soon discover something even stranger. When lead detectives step into Denise's bedroom, they are hit by a scene that looks completely manufactured. Denise is lying on her bed, her life entirely stolen from her in a hyper-violent attack. Resting just inches from her body is a heavy, stained, wood-splitting axe. There are no signs of forced entry. There are absolutely no broken windows. There are no missing valuables. The perimeter of the house is entirely intact. The front door was secure, and the back door requires a physical key to lock or unlock from both the inside and the outside. This leaves detectives with a chilling, impossible puzzle. How does a foreign intruder bypass multiple defensive dogs, enter a locked home without breaking a single latch, carry out a brutal execution with an axe found on the property, and vanish without leaving a trace? This next discovery is exactly why stories like this matter. It challenges everything we think we know about the safety of our own homes. As investigators look at the physical evidence, the questions begin to stack. If an outsider committed this act, why did they choose a weapon from the property instead of bringing their own? Why exactly did the dogs remain silent? The immediate suspicion falls on the only other person inside the home when the 911 call was placed. Carlos is escorted away from the scene and placed into the back of a police cruiser. At this stage, he is treated as a traumatized witness, a grieving son who just made a horrifying discovery. But as the forensic team begins mapping out the timeline of July 19th, the teenager's behavior begins to drift away from standard human grief. Then the evidence pointed somewhere nobody expected. During his initial transport, Carlos sits quietly, showing no physical signs of panic or distress. He doesn't ask questions about who could have done this to his mother. He does not even demand justice. Instead, he maintains a cold, analytical silence. When investigators sit him down for his first formal interview, they expect to hear a detailed account of an intruder or a strange vehicle in the area. Instead, Carlos offers a timeline that feels entirely too neat, too rehearsed, and deeply detached from the violence that occurred just down the hallway from his bedroom. Moments like these remind us how quickly ordinary life can change, and how little we might truly know about the people sleeping under our own roofs. Carlos looks directly at the detectives and explains his day. He tells them he spent his afternoon focusing on ordinary, everyday tasks. He details his movements with precision. He tells them he came home, ate a slice of pie, and went to sleep for a long afternoon nap. He claims that while his mother was being attacked with a heavy tool inside her own bed, he was completely unconscious, wrapped in a deep, undisturbed sleep just a few feet away. He insists that he heard absolutely nothing. No screams, no struggle, no impact. It is truly a bold defense strategy. He insists that he heard absolutely nothing. The bedroom doors are thin. The home's layout is compact. A violent assault with a wood-splitting axe creates an immense, unmistakable amount of noise. Yet, Carlos stands firm on his narrative. He was napping, entirely oblivious to the world around him. But the footage revealed something police weren't prepared for. As detectives cross-examine his timeline against the physical layout of the house, they realize something doesn't match. They begin to review the digital footprint of the home, pulling data from security sensors and local networks. They are looking for any proof of a third party entering the property while Carlos was supposedly asleep. But instead of finding footprints outside or forced latches on the windows, the digital forensic unit extracts a single piece of data that completely shatters the teenager's nap and pie defense baseline. The data proves that a specific door was opened and closed during the exact window Carlos claimed he was asleep. But investigators discovered it wasn't an outside door, it was an internal boundary. And as detectives look closer at the physical state of the suspect sitting across from them, their eyes drop to his hands, where a fresh, microscopic physical anomaly is hidden in plain sight. What started as a standard emergency response to a home invasion had just turned into a dark, psychological standoff. Investigators realize they are not dealing with a grieving victim. They are sitting across from a highly controlled, calculating mind. But they need more than a broken timeline to prove premeditation. They need to find the exact link connecting the boy to the weapon resting on his mother's bed. And that is when Carlos makes his first fatal operational mistake. Before detectives even mention the forensic processing of the axe, the 17-year-old leans forward and offers an explanation for why his biological data might be all over the weapon. But his explanation would open a deeper, far more terrifying mystery that nobody in that room was ready to face. Would you have noticed the warning signs if someone close to you began displaying this level of detached calculation? The investigators inside the room received a silent cue from the technical team outside the glass. The trap was beginning to take shape. They shifted their approach, moving away from general questions about the afternoon, and focusing intently on Carlos's physical interaction with the home. They asked him if he had touched anything in his mother's room when he discovered her body. Carlos stated he had only approached the bed, realized she was unresponsive, and immediately backed away to dial 911. He was careful to state that he never touched the weapon. He wanted to ensure his hands were kept completely clean of the physical mechanics of the crime scene. Then the lead detective took a slow, deep breath, leaned across the table, and asked Carlos to hold out his hands. The teenager complied, lifting his palms upward into the harsh fluorescent light. To a casual observer, his hands looked normal, the hands of a healthy 17-year-old athlete. But the detective pulled a high-magnification lens from his pocket and leaned in close. There, running along the inside alignment of Carlos's fingers and across the meat of his lower palm, were a series of fresh, microscopic abrasions and tiny, linear skin tears. They were not deep lacerations, they were friction anomalies, the exact type of micro-trauma caused by the intense, unvarnished wooden handle of a heavy utility tool slipping under high force against bare skin. What started as a simple request to examine his hands quickly expanded into a major psychological crisis for the suspect. Carlos stared at his own palms, his face remaining calm, but his mind was clearly recalculating the field. He knew the microabrasions were there, and he knew what they represented. Before the detective could even voice the question, before the investigator could ask how a teenager who had spent his entire afternoon wrapped in a deep sleep could develop fresh friction injuries on his gripping surfaces, Carlos shifted his weight. He realized his clean hands narrative was about to be obliterated by forensic science. And that is when he made his first massive operational error. He did not wait for the accusation. He did not wait for the lab results. Instead, he volunteered an entirely new explanation for why his biological material, his touch, DNA, and his physical skin cells would be discovered on the unvarnished wood of the axe handle resting on his mother's bed. His voice remained steady, but the words he chose would open a massive open loop that would ultimately seal his fate. The explanation Carlos offered for the fresh friction marks on his hands was as creative as it was dangerous. He claimed that a few days prior to the incident, he had helped his mother move several old tools out of the outdoor utility shed, including the wood-splitting axe. He asserted that any DNA or physical trace found on the handle was simply residual material from past household chores. It was a tactical attempt to get out ahead of the forensic data, a defensive move designed to neutralize the impact of any upcoming lab matches. The detectives recorded his statement without contradiction. They let him commit to the story, knowing that forensic science can differentiate between old, degraded epithelial cells and fresh, high-impact touch DNA transferred under extreme physical pressure. But as the investigation moved past those initial high-stress 48 hours, the narrative began to expand far beyond the walls of that windowless room. The Citrus County Homicide Unit realized that to understand the violence of July 19, 2019, they had to systematically peel back the layers of the Hollowell family history. They launched a comprehensive multi-week background investigation, interviewing teachers, neighbors, classmates, and extended family members. What they found was a classic psychological duality: a public facade of absolute suburban perfection, concealing a private reality of escalating domestic tension, resentment, and a cold, calculating struggle for control. But investigators would soon discover something even stranger. Denise Hollowell was a woman who had dedicated her entire life to the concept of profound empathy. She wasn't just a mother by biological circumstance, she was a woman who chose motherhood as a mission. As a highly respected educator and community figure, she specialized in taking in children from difficult, fractured backgrounds, children who had experienced early life trauma and required an immense amount of structure, patience, and love to heal. She had opened her heart to Carlos when he was a young child, adopting him and providing him with an environment of stability, privilege, and high expectations. To the outside world, Carlos was the ultimate success story of Denise's methodology. He was an honors student, visually striking, physically fit, and possessed an articulate, polite demeanor that charmed every adult he encountered. But as detectives began executing search warrants on the digital devices found within the home, the polished image of the perfect son began to fracture. They recovered deleted text chains, internal emails, and archived journal entries that revealed a deeply toxic shift in the home's dynamic over the preceding 9 weeks. Carlos wasn't the submissive, grateful honors student he pretended to be in public. Behind closed doors, he was developing a profound, narcissistic resentment toward his mother's authority. Denise was a structured disciplinarian. She believed in rules, accountability, and the maintenance of clear personal boundaries. She expected Carlos to maintain his grades, contribute to the heavy upkeep of their lakeside property, and follow the guidelines she had established for his transition into adulthood. What happened next changed the entire case. To Carlos, these normal parental expectations were interpreted as an intolerable assault on his personal autonomy. The digital records showed that in the months leading up to July, Denise had begun placing an increasing number of restrictions on his movements and privileges. She had confronted him about variations in his academic performance, his choice of peer groups, and what she explicitly described to a friend as his complete lack of direction and growing sense of entitlement. She had restricted his access to certain financial resources and tied his use of the family vehicles directly to his performance of domestic duties and behavioral compliance. This next discovery is exactly why stories like this matter. It exposes the hidden danger that can grow inside a family when normal discipline triggers an extreme psychological response. As investigators charted this domestic timeline, they realized that Carlos's psychological reaction to these rules was completely abnormal. Where a typical teenager might complain, withdraw, or engage in standard verbal arguments, Carlos responded with a cold, calculated strategy of behavioral resistance. He began tracking his mother's movements, documenting her schedule, and analyzing the physical security parameters of the house. Neighbors later reported to detectives that they had witnessed Carlos standing in the yard for long periods, simply staring at the master bedroom window with an unblinking, unreadable expression. Then the evidence pointed somewhere nobody expected. The forensic team analyzing Denise's personal computer recovered an unsent email draft written just 4 days before her life was taken. The text was raw, filled with a mother's profound anxiety and a growing sense of physical unease inside her own home. She wrote about a chilling shift in Carlos's demeanor, a cold reality. She noted that he had stopped arguing with her entirely. Instead, he would simply stand in the doorway, watching her with a detached, analytical gaze that made her blood run cold. She described an incident where she awoke in the middle of the night to find Carlos standing silently in the dark hallway just outside her bedroom, his figure illuminated only by the ambient light of the moon. He simply stated he was getting a glass of water, turned around, and walked back to his room with a slow, deliberate pace. He simply stated he was getting a glass of water, turned around, and walked back to his room with a slow, deliberate pace. This level of psychological calculation suggests a lengthy period of preparation before the actual flashpoint occurred. Carlos was not an impulsive teenager who snapped in a moment of sudden anger. He was an individual who was systematically desensitizing himself to the act he was planning to execute. He was mapping out the spatial constraints of the house, calculating the acoustic profiles of the walls, and ensuring that when the moment arrived, he could execute his plan with absolute precision. But the footage revealed something police weren't prepared for. As detectives expanded their search into Carlos's personal digital footprint, they found that his academic success was paired with a dark, consuming interest in forensic countermeasures. His search history was filled with inquiries regarding DNA transfer dynamics, latent fingerprint development, and the specific limitations of blood spatter analysis. He had spent hours researching how investigators process outdoor utility tools and how a suspect can successfully maintain an alibi during a high-velocity physical assault. This wasn't the casual curiosity of a true crime fan. It was a systematic operational study conducted by an individual preparing to engage in a real-world forensic battle with law enforcement. Moments like these remind us how little we might truly know about the internal world of those we share our lives with. Denise believed she was managing a difficult, defiant teenager who needed firm guidance. She had no idea she was living with a cold, calculating mind that was actively studying how to end her life and evade the legal consequences. The tension within the home reached its absolute peak on the morning of July 19th, the final day. Witnesses later confirmed that Denise had a sharp, definitive conversation with Carlos regarding his failure to complete a series of assigned property tasks and his recent academic behavior. It was a conversation centered on accountability, the final imposition of structure on a personality that could not tolerate any external control. For Carlos, this conversation was the final catalyst. His narcissistic mask had failed to protect him from his mother's rules, and he decided to remove the source of those rules permanently. But what Carlos failed to realize was that his forensic research had a massive flaw. He had prepared for a traditional physical investigation, but he had completely underestimated the power of digital behavioral forensics. He believed that by creating a simple nap and pie alibi and providing a premature explanation for his DNA on the tool, he could outsmart the detectives sitting across from him. He was about to find out that the evidence left behind was far more complex than a few skin cells on an axe handle. The physical processing of a weapon like a wood-splitting axe is a meticulous, highly scientific operation. Inside the Citrus County Forensic Laboratory, technicians under high-intensity UV lighting began the process of dismantling Carlos's premature defense. When Carlos had volunteered that he had touched the axe days prior while moving tools, he had operated under the assumption that DNA is a static, indistinct marker, that a touch is a touch, regardless of context. But modern forensic science focuses on quantitative and directional mechanics. When an individual handles a tool casually for chores, they leave low-density, scattered epithelial deposits along the natural gripping surfaces. However, when that same tool is swung with maximum physical force against a high-resistance target, the friction forces the skin cells deep into the porous grain of the unvarnished wood, creating a highly dense, concentrated forensic profile. Furthermore, the lab team discovered something that completely invalidated his story of casual tool organization. Deep within the recessed grain of the wooden handle, layered underneath a fresh deposit of high-density touch DNA matching Carlos Hollowell, were trace microscopic elements of organic matter that belonged exclusively to Denise. This meant the tool had not been clean when it was wielded, and the transfer of Carlos's genetic material had occurred simultaneously with the high-velocity impact event. The forensic sequencing established a timeline of contact that could not be explained away by a casual chore days in the past. It was a direct, scientific link connecting the boy's physical grip to the weapon at the exact moment of execution. Indisputable proof. But investigators would soon discover something even stranger. While the physical lab work was confirming the scientific reality, the behavioral analysis unit was reviewing the audio and video records of Carlos's initial hours in detention. A standard psychological response to the sudden, violent loss of a parent involves a severe disruption of cognitive focus, high emotional volatility, and a deep, continuous demand for information about what happened. Individuals in genuine shock frequently ask for details about the crime scene, express terror regarding the killer's identity, and look for reassurance from authority figures. Carlos displayed the exact inverse of these traits. His behavioral profile was characterized by an eerie stillness, a complete lack of affective resonance. When the detectives intentionally introduced graphic descriptions of the crime scene into the conversation to gauge his emotional response, Carlos's heart rate, monitored via subtle physiological indicators on the high-definition recording system, remained perfectly flat. He did not flinch at any of the graphic details provided. He did not cover his face. He sat with his hands folded, watching the detectives with an expression that shifted between mild boredom and subtle intellectual arrogance. It was a presentation of cold indifference that veteran investigators recognized as a core indicator of a low empathy, highly detached psychological profile. What happened next changed the entire case. The lead detective decided to test Carlos's psychological limits by executing a classic behavioral trap. He walked back into the interrogation room carrying a thick forensic file folder, placing it deliberately on the table between them. He looked Carlos directly in the eyes and stated that the initial laboratory results had just been returned from the state matrix system. He lied to the suspect, telling him that a complex, high-velocity blood spatter pattern had been identified on the lower legs of the denim shorts Carlos was wearing when the 911 call was placed. This was a critical moment of psychological pressure. If Carlos was truly innocent, if he had truly been asleep in his bedroom and only approached the master bed briefly before backing away to call emergency services, his brain should have processed this statement with total confusion and immediate denial. An innocent person knows they were not present during the violent event, and therefore, high-velocity spatter on their clothing is a physical impossibility. They will challenge the data, demand to see the proof, or express absolute shock. This next discovery is exactly why stories like this matter. It demonstrates how a guilty mind, trapped by its own calculated logic, will instantly pivot to explain away new evidence rather than simply state the truth. Carlos did not express confusion. He did not deny the physical possibility of the spatter. Instead, his eyes dropped to the forensic folder, his jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, and he immediately launched into a highly technical, manufactured explanation. He stated that when he entered the bedroom and found his mother, he had leaned over her body to check for a pulse, and that during this physical interaction, a transfer of organic material must have occurred due to residual pressure or proximity. He was actively trying to adapt his alibi to accommodate the new forensic reality the detective had introduced. By accepting the presence of the spatter and trying to explain it away, he effectively admitted to a level of physical proximity and interaction with the crime scene that completely violated his initial nap and pie narrative baseline. Then the evidence pointed somewhere nobody expected. The detective let out a slow, cold breath. He didn't reveal the trap just yet. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and allowed the silence in the room to build. The psychological weight of that silence was immense. In a real interrogation environment, silence is a physical weapon. A guilty suspect feels an overwhelming internal pressure to fill the void, to continue building the wall of their alibi, to ensure that every corner is covered. Carlos, sensing that his pulse-checking explanation might not be enough, leaned forward and volunteered another piece of unprompted information. He began detailing the exact structural dimensions of the outdoor utility shed where the axe was kept. He explained that the latch on the shed door was loose, suggesting that anyone from the neighborhood could have easily walked onto the property, retrieved the axe, used it, and returned it without his knowledge. He was desperately trying to reintroduce the concept of an outside phantom into the narrative, but he was doing so with an intricate level of detail that betrayed his absolute obsession with the mechanics of the crime scene. He was describing the physical state of the property with a precision that didn't match his claim of a detached, unobservant teenager who had simply been sleeping through the afternoon. But the footage revealed something police weren't prepared for. Outside the interrogation room, the digital analysis team had finished rendering a 3D structural model of the house's internal acoustic profiles, cross-referencing it with the exact timestamp of the internal door sensor cycles they had extracted earlier. The forensic door access data was completely definitive. The door leading to the outdoor utility area had been accessed from the inside at 3:14 p.m. Following that access, the internal sensor in the hallway outside the master bedroom registered a series of movements matching a heavy, deliberate stride. There was no signature of a hurried flight, no indication of a chaotic break-in. The digital house was telling a story of a controlled, internal execution carried out by someone who had full, unrestricted access to every room. The detectives inside the room knew they had reached the point of no return. They had the touch DNA deep within the grain of the handle. They had the physical friction abrasions on the suspect's gripping surfaces. They had the digital tracking records that disproved his timeline. And they had his own contradictory statements recorded on video. It was time to strip away the supportive, empathetic mask and confront Carlos Hollowell with the raw, undeniable reality of his actions. The ultimate psychological battle was about to begin inside that small, windowless space. The final phase of the interrogation of Carlos Hollowell is a classic example of tactical interviewing. The lead investigator, a veteran with decades of experience dealing with detached, low-empathy personalities, shifted his posture. He leaned forward, placing his forearms on the table, eliminating the physical distance between himself and the 17-year-old suspect. The supportive tone was entirely gone, replaced by a cold clinical authority that signaled to Carlos that the field of play had completely changed. "Carlos," the detective began, his voice low and steady, dropping like a heavy weight into the quiet room. "We've been sitting here for hours, and I've listened to you tell me about your afternoon. I've listened to you talk about your pie, your nap, and your deep sleep. But here's the problem. The house you live in doesn't lie. The digital networks inside that property don't have an alibi to protect. They just record the cold, hard facts." Carlos did not shift his gaze. His eyes remained locked on the investigator, but a subtle change occurred in his facial muscles. The relaxed, bored expression began to harden into a defensive posture. He didn't speak, he simply waited for the next card to be played. "Our digital forensics team has pulled the complete data strings from your home's router and internal security logs," the detective continued, tapping his finger on the thick folder between them. "At the exact hour you claim you were wrapped in an undisturbed sleep, the internal sensors show that you were actively moving through that hallway. More importantly, we have processed your hands, Carlos. The microabrasions and friction tears inside your fingers match the unvarnished handle of that axe perfectly. You didn't touch that tool days ago. You handled it today, with maximum force." But investigators would soon discover something even stranger. Instead of collapsing under the weight of this evidence, instead of exhibiting the typical emotional breakdown or confession that standard suspects present when their alibi is completely dismantled, Carlos maintained his cold, analytical defense. He leaned back in his plastic chair, crossed his arms, and let out a short, dry breath that was almost a laugh. "You guys are detectives, aren't you?" Carlos said, his voice flat, completely devoid of any emotional color. "If you have all this data and you have all these files, then aren't you supposed to figure this out? Why are you asking me? I told you what I remember. I was asleep. If your sensors say something else, then your sensors are wrong." The sheer audacity of his response was staggering. He was directly challenging the objective physical and digital reality of the case, choosing to rely entirely on his own internal narrative. He was attempting to gaslight the investigation, operating under the narcissistic belief that his intelligence could outmatch the collective weight of forensic science. What happened next changed the entire case. The second investigator inside the room took over the line of questioning, his voice sharper, more confrontational. "Carlos, your mother is dead just down the hall from where you sat. She was brutally executed with a utility tool. And you're sitting here playing word games with us? You're telling me you don't care? Look at yourself. Your attitude about this whole thing is very sociopathic. You saw something horrible, and you don't care about it at all." "Sociopathic?" Carlos responded, tilting his head slightly, his eyes cold and unblinking. "I don't know about that. I'm just telling you what I did. You're the ones putting on a show here." "A show?" the first detective cut in, his voice rising slightly, cutting off the suspect's deflection. "The only show being put on here is by you, Carlos. You've been putting on a really good show since the moment we arrived at that house. You put on a show for the 911 dispatcher, screaming and pretending to be a terrified child. But the moment our deputies walked through that front door, the show failed. The guard dogs didn't bark because they knew the killer. The doors were locked from the inside because the killer never left the house. You executed your mother. You placed that tool on her bed. You checked your timeline, and you waited until 6:15 p.m. to place that call. This next discovery is exactly why stories like this matter. It highlights the terrifying reality of a suspect who can look directly at the destruction of their family and feel absolutely nothing but a desire to protect themselves. The room fell into an intense, suffocating silence. The investigators stared at Carlos, waiting for the crack, waiting for the small emotional opening that would allow them to extract a formal confession. They knew that at this point, a confession wasn't legally required to secure an arrest warrant. The physical and digital evidence was already overwhelming. But a confession provides the final narrative closure for the family and the justice system. Carlos did not give them that satisfaction. He sat perfectly still, his breathing steady, his face an impenetrable mask of psychological detachment. He had committed completely to his alternative reality, and he realized that to change his story now would be a definitive admission of defeat. He chose to go down with the ship of his alibi, calculating that if he never admitted to the physical mechanics of the act, a defense attorney might find a structural loophole in the state's circumstantial chain. Then the evidence pointed somewhere nobody expected. The lead detective realized that the psychological battle inside the room had reached its natural limit. He stood up, picked up the thick forensic folder, and looked down at the 17-year-old honors student. "Carlos Antonio Hollowell," the detective said with a quiet, absolute authority. "You are under arrest for the first-degree premeditated murder of your mother, Denise Hollowell. Stand up, turn around, and put your hands behind your back." Carlos stood up with a slow, deliberate movement. He did not fight. He did not protest his innocence. He turned his back to the investigators, allowed the steel cuffs to be clicked tightly around his wrists, and walked out of the interrogation room without looking back a single time. The street-level investigation had concluded. The arena was about to shift from the stark intensity of the interrogation wing to the high-stakes, structured environment of the Citrus County Criminal Court, where the state would lay out the complete, terrifying sequence of what truly occurred inside that locked house on July 19, 2019. The transition from a homicide investigation to a capital trial requires a transformation of raw evidence into a compelling narrative structure. In July 2021, 2 years after Denise Hollowell lost her life, the state of Florida opened its case against Carlos Antonio Hollowell inside a packed courtroom in Citrus County. The prosecution team understood that to secure a conviction for first-degree premeditated murder against an intelligent, clean-cut teenager, they had to do more than present forensic spreadsheets. They had to pull back the curtain on the hidden psychology of the home and expose the exact motive that turned an honors student into an axe-wielding predator. The defense team attempted to leverage Carlos's age and his pristine academic record, arguing that the state's case was entirely circumstantial. They leaned heavily on the lack of an eyewitness and the absence of a direct confession from the interrogation tapes. They painted a picture of an alternate reality, one where an unknown intruder, an agile phantom, had managed to slip past the dogs, access the house, use the property's own tools, and vanish, leaving a traumatized boy to discover the aftermath. But investigators would soon discover something even stranger. When the prosecution team took the podium for their opening statements, they bypassed the abstract legal jargon and went straight to the core issue: control and narcissistic retaliation. They argued that the motive behind the execution was remarkably petty, yet profoundly terrifying. In the months leading up to July 2019, Denise Hollowell had begun enforcing standard parental boundaries on her 17-year-old son. She had confronted him about variations in his school grades. She had questioned his future plans, and she had placed clear limits on his social independence, forcing him to earn his privileges through accountability and household duties. To a healthy individual, these boundaries are a normal part of adolescent development. But to a personality holding deep, unaddressed narcissistic entitlement, any external control is perceived as a total assault on their identity. The prosecution systematically built a timeline showing that Carlos did not snap in a moment of sudden, blinding rage. He had spent weeks letting his resentment simmer, transforming minor domestic rules into a desperate justification for extreme violence. What happened next changed the entire case. The state called their lead digital forensics specialist to the stand. The courtroom went entirely dark as a massive projection screen illuminated the space with the raw data strings extracted from the house's internal network. The specialist walked the jury through the minute-by-minute digital reality of July 19, 2019. The records showed that at exactly 3:14 p.m., the internal sensors registered a series of movements that completely dismantled the defense's narrative. Carlos was not asleep. He was actively navigating the corridor. The prosecution then introduced the definitive forensic weapon data. They presented the high-magnification analysis of the wood-splitting axe handle, demonstrating that Carlos's touch DNA was not a superficial, old deposit. It was forced deep into the porous grain of the wood under immense physical pressure, a signature of contact that could only be left by an individual swinging the tool with maximum physical force against a target. The microscopic friction tears on Carlos's gripping surfaces provided the final physical validation, matching the exact pressure points of the long handle. This next discovery is exactly why stories like this matter. It demonstrates how modern digital forensics can look through a suspect's manufactured timeline and reconstruct a crime scene with absolute certainty. The emotional peak of the trial arrived when the prosecution played the unedited video recordings of Carlos's behavior during his hours inside the interrogation room. The jury watched in absolute silence as the 17-year-old sat across from homicide detectives, displaying no grief, no remorse, and a complete absence of basic human empathy. His flat, indifferent response to his mother's death. "You guys are detectives. Aren't you supposed to figure this out?" echoed through the quiet courtroom, chilling everyone present. It stripped away any lingering illusion of a frightened, innocent child, exposing the cold, calculating mind beneath the social mask. The defense's case systematically fell apart under the weight of this cross-examination. Their argument of an outside intruder required the jury to accept a series of impossible coincidences. That an outsider knew exactly where the axe was kept, left the entryways perfectly secure, didn't trigger a single bark from the defensive guard dogs, and left behind an internal digital trail that perfectly aligned with Carlos's movements, while leaving no external trace of their own presence. Then the evidence pointed somewhere nobody expected. Following a grueling multi-day trial, the case was turned over to the jury for deliberation. The tension inside the courthouse was palpable. A community was waiting to see if the justice system would hold a young, high-achieving teenager accountable for the ultimate domestic betrayal. The jury did not take long. After analyzing the seamless intersection of the digital logs, the physical DNA profiles, and the compelling behavioral evidence, they returned to the courtroom with a unanimous decision. Carlos Antonio Hollowell was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. The judge looked down at the teenager, whose expression remained as flat and unreadable during the reading of the verdict as it had been inside the interrogation room. Because Carlos was exactly 17 years old at the time he committed the crime, the legal framework required a specialized sentencing approach under modern statutory guidelines. He could not be executed, but the court was determined to ensure public safety. He was sentenced to life in prison. However, due to his status as a juvenile offender at the time of the offense, a specific legal clause was woven into his final sentence, a clause that introduces a deep, lingering, open loop that continues to challenge the community's understanding of long-term justice. The closing of a trial file is rarely the true conclusion of a true crime narrative. When Carlos Hollowell was transported from the Citrus County Jail to a maximum security state correctional facility to begin serving his life sentence, the physical threat he posed to his immediate surroundings was neutralized. But the psychological wake of his actions continued to ripple through the community and the legal system. Denise Hollowell had dedicated her life to the absolute belief that structure, love, and therapeutic intervention could heal a fractured mind, that a child's past did not have to dictate a violent future. The reality of her death at the hands of the boy she had chosen to protect stands as a profound, troubling paradox at the heart of modern behavioral psychology. Inside the prison system, Carlos transitioned from an honors student living a life of middle-class privilege to an inmate navigating a harsh world. Reports from correctional staff suggest that his behavioral patterns remained entirely consistent with the profile observed during his interrogation. He maintained a quiet, highly controlled demeanor, showing an intellectual arrogance and a total absence of residual remorse or emotional accountability for the destruction of his family. He remains a case study in low empathy, calculated behavioral modeling. But investigators would soon discover something even stranger. The true aftershock of the Carlos Hollowell case lies within the precise technical wording of his judicial sentence. Under modern legal precedents governing juvenile justice, a minor convicted of a capital offense cannot be subjected to a life sentence without any hope of release, as it is viewed as a form of unconstitutional punishment for a developing brain. Therefore, the state of Florida was required to include a mandatory possibility of judicial review after 25 years clause into his file. This means that Carlos's life sentence is not a permanent closure. It is a ticking clock. In the year 2044, when Carlos reaches his early 40s, he will legally step back into a courtroom for a comprehensive sentence review. A panel of judges and behavioral experts will analyze his institutional record, evaluate his psychological status, and determine whether he has achieved a level of genuine rehabilitation that would allow him to safely return to society. What happened next changed the entire case. This impending milestone introduces a profound moral and philosophical dilemma for anyone who analyzes this narrative. If an individual demonstrates a capacity for cold, calculated domestic violence at the age of 17, if they can systematically plan the execution of their own mother, manufacture a detached nap and pie alibi, and face homicide investigators with complete indifference, can 25 years inside a prison cell truly alter the underlying psychological wiring? Or does it simply provide a calculating mind with more time to study how to build a better, more effective social mask? This next discovery is exactly why stories like this matter. It forces us to confront the limitations of our judicial systems and the boundaries of human reform. If you were sitting on the Judicial Review panel in the year 2044, looking across the table at an articulate, middle-aged Carlos Hollowell who has followed every institutional rule for 2 decades, what would you decide? Would you trust the polished, polite presentation that once charmed an entire high school? Or would you remember the digital tracking data and the heavy wood-splitting axe resting on Denise's bed? The story of Carlos Hollowell is a stark reminder that the deepest dangers are not always the foreign threats that bypass our home security. Sometimes, they are the cold, unreadable realities growing quietly right down the hallway from where we sleep. As the countdown to 2044 continues, the legacy of Denise Hollowell remains caught between her life's work of unconditional empathy and the ultimate violent rejection of that empathy by the son she tried to save. It is a case that challenges our understanding of nature versus nurture, the limits of rehabilitation, and the terrifying capacity of the human mind to wear a flawless social mask while harbor an absolute destructive malice. What are your honest thoughts on this case? Did the system deliver genuine justice for Denise Hollowell? Or does the 2044 review clause leave our communities exposed to an unrepentant, calculating mind? Let us know your perspective in the comments down below. Your thoughts help keep these important conversations alive.